My name is Evelyn Hart, and the moment my daughter-in-law stood in the middle of my living room and said, "Let me be clear, this is not your home anymore," something inside me stopped breathing. I stood there holding a basket of folded laundry, the television humming in the background, and I felt as if the walls themselves pulled back to watch what would happen next. My son stood behind her, his eyes fixed hard on the floor, like a guilty boy who didn't want to witness his own wrongdoing. I didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't ask her what gave her the right to say such a thing in a house I had lived in for nearly 40 years. I simply looked at her, the tremble of rage in her voice, the wild need to win, and set the laundry down on the nearest chair. This was the house where I raised my son. The house where my late husband and I scraped and saved through long winters and 2 recessions, clipping coupons and patching roofs ourselves because hiring help was a luxury we couldn't afford. The house with pencil marks on the kitchen doorway, where our boy's height was measured year after year, and where my husband wrote 2020, grown man, with a smile so wide I thought he'd never stop. That hallway was still stained from the night my son spilled cherry Kool-Aid at 6 years old. I scrubbed that floor until my knuckles hurt, but the faint shadow stayed like a memory that refused to let go. And now, she stood there claiming it as hers, with her manicured nails and her voice that always carried more bite than warmth. I watched her and wondered how she could believe she'd earned the right to dismiss me. She'd only been married to my son for 2 years. 2 years compared to my 40 in that same house. But I didn't say any of that. I didn't tell her what it felt like to watch them move into the upstairs bedroom and put away the quilt I made for my husband. I didn't mention that I noticed the framed wedding picture of her and my son replacing the one of my family of 3 on the mantel. I didn't say I'd heard her late one night whispering through the vents that it was time to move his mother out, as though I were a piece of old furniture she didn't know what to do with. Instead, I gave her the only thing I could still control: my silence. I folded my hands in front of me and looked at my son, waiting for him to step forward to say something, to remind her that the mortgage had my name on it, that the taxes were paid out of my Social Security after his father died. He swallowed, but didn't speak. The kind of silence that cuts deeper than any words. It told me everything I needed to know. So I nodded. Just once. Calm. Slow. Like someone who suddenly sees the whole picture, not just the argument of the moment, but the path that led here. My husband would have said it was the devil of pride, that little spark that grows when no one bothers to catch it early. I walked into the bedroom that was once ours, where the quilt still lay folded at the foot of the bed. I opened the closet, reached for the same overnight bag I used on hospital trips and funerals. I put in 2 changes of clothes, the old Bible my husband's aunt gave us when we first moved into the house, and the photo of the 3 of us taken at the county fair. My son on my husband's shoulders, both of them grinning like the future belonged wholly to them. When I came back out, my daughter-in-law stood stiff, as if she expected me to argue or beg or scream her off my property. Instead, I smiled a smile I didn't even feel forming and said, "All right." Those 2 words startled her more than any fury would have. She wasn't prepared for surrender, or at least what she mistook to be surrender. Some people only feel powerful when there is conflict. When you refuse to fuel the fire, they don't know what to do with the match. With my bag in hand, I passed my son again. I touched his arm gently and whispered, "You'll understand one day." His eyes widened, and I saw the boy he used to be flicker inside him, the boy who ran to me with scraped knees and nightmares. But the man who stood there didn't move. I stepped onto the porch, closed the door behind me, and felt the weight of years press against my chest, not as pain, but as clarity. The cold Indiana air wrapped itself around me. The sky was gray and low, the kind that promises snow, even if it doesn't fall. My feet turned toward the church instinctively. First, United Methodist a block and a half down the road. I'd been walking that same path since my 20s for weddings, funerals, bake sales, grief groups. I knew every crack in the sidewalk, every maple root pushing up a slab of concrete. But this time, the walk felt different. Not like going somewhere familiar. More like crossing a threshold from the house I'd built with my husband into a future I wasn't sure I wanted, but knew I had to face. The church doors were unlocked, as they often were before evening service. Inside, it smelled of old wood candles and a faint trace of lemon oil from Saturday's cleaning crew. The sanctuary was empty and still. The stained glass windows glowed with winter light, and the cross above the altar shimmered gold. In that silent room, I set my bag down and knelt for the first time in months. Not to pray for strength, I wasn't sure I had the words for that yet, but simply to tell God what had happened. To say I am hurt and I don't understand. And for once, I didn't try to make excuses for anyone. But that was only the beginning. I woke up on one of the hard wooden pews the next morning, my neck stiff and my fingers cold from gripping my coat through the night. I must have drifted off sometime after telling God everything I was holding in. It wasn't a graceful prayer, not the kind you hear spoken into microphones on Sunday mornings. It was more like emptying a heavy suitcase. Why did my husband leave me with all the responsibility? Why had my son drifted so far away? Why did I feel like the outsider in the very life I built? The church was dim in the early light, only a few stained glass windows brightening with thin ribbons of dawn. The cross hanging above the altar glowed faintly, as if someone had turned the lights down low for a moment of reflection. It felt fitting, because I felt dimmed myself, muted, unsure of where I belonged, now that I'd been pushed out of the one place I was certain I had a right to. I sat up slowly and rubbed my eyes. My joints ached the way they always did when the cold weather set in, and my lower back protested after a night without a mattress. I let out a long sigh, the kind mothers learn to release without knowing they're doing it. I've heard it from older women in church whispering through their own burdens. The sigh that means you keep going anyway. The town was already coming awake outside. I could hear a delivery truck backing up at the bakery across the street and the distant rumble of a school bus. Normal life moving on, even if my world felt like it had cracked right down the center. I made my way to the small kitchen in the back hall where the church ladies kept supplies for potlucks. I found stale coffee grounds, a battered percolator, and a carton of powdered creamer that expired 6 months ago. I sniffed it, shrugged, and scooped it anyway. It wasn't dignity I was after, just warmth. And sitting at that folding table, drinking lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup, I finally let myself feel the full truth. My son didn't defend me. He didn't stop her. He didn't even ask me to stay. The boy I raised would have stood on the roof to protect me. The man he became stood silent while I packed a bag. That realization was what finally made my chest ache, not the words she said. I stared down into the dregs of my coffee and thought of his father, steady, hard-working, and full of patience. He died too young, and in the years after I lived in survival mode. Pay the bills, stretch the groceries, stay strong for the boy. Work nights at the community hospital because I needed the health insurance. And all along, I kept telling myself when he gets married, I'll finally rest. We'll be a bigger family. The table will grow, not shrink. But families don't always expand the way we imagine. Sometimes they fracture. Sometimes one strong personality pulls someone toward a life that doesn't have room for the old pieces. And sometimes the person doing the pushing doesn't even realize how much damage they're causing, at least not yet. After finishing the last cold sip, I walked back into the sanctuary and sat in my usual pew, third row on the left. I liked it there because I could see the choir loft, and I always pretended my husband was up there watching me sing, even though he never could carry a tune. That's when the memory hit me like a sudden gust. The lockbox, top shelf of the hall closet, his papers, the ones I'd never opened after he died. I stood up so fast my knees buckled. How could I have forgotten that? In the chaos of grief years ago, I tucked away everything, the insurance statements, the will, the house deed, telling myself I'd deal with them when I was ready. Ready never came. Life rolled on, and I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But now, after being told I didn't belong in my own house, I suddenly knew I needed to see those papers. Not because I wanted to wave them in her face, but because I needed to know the truth for myself. Where did I actually stand? What did the law say, even if my son and his wife didn't? I slipped my bag over my shoulder again and left the church, locking the door behind me with the spare key the pastor insisted I keep years ago after I led the grief support group. The sky was pale blue and brittle looking, and the street was dusted with frost. Walking back toward the house felt surreal, like I was ghosting through a life that no longer belonged to me. I passed the maple tree I planted when my husband and I first moved in. It towered high now, branches stretching wide as if to shelter everything below. When our son was little, he used to swing from the lowest limb and pretend it was an airplane wing. I smiled at the memory, though it stung. How did a boy who once screamed, "Mom, don't let go," become a man who let me walk away without a word? When I reached the front porch, I hesitated. The door was still unlocked, a sign they didn't expect me back or didn't care if I came in. The house smelled like coffee and scrambled eggs. Normal morning life, just without me in it. I slipped quietly down the hallway past the closed bedroom door where they slept and into the hall closet. There it was, the metal lockbox, a little dusty, heavier than I remembered. I carried it into the kitchen, sat at the table I once wiped down 100,000 times, and turned the key. Inside were documents, death certificates, tax forms, and then a manila envelope marked in my husband's handwriting, "For Evelyn when you need it most." My hands shook. Maybe I hadn't been ready until now. I slid the papers into my bag, carefully making sure not even a corner stuck out. No one heard me leave. I walked straight back to the church, back to the one place I knew I still belonged, even if nowhere else seemed to want me. And as I pushed open the heavy doors, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. I didn't stop walking until I was back inside the sanctuary door shut behind me, the cold quiet wrapping around me like a thin blanket. I sat with the lockbox on my lap, listening to the echo of my own breathing. Funny how a place that once felt like a community gathering room could suddenly feel like the only safe room in the world. I rested the box on the pew beside me, but couldn't bring myself to open the envelope just yet. I needed a moment, maybe several, to gather courage. There's a strange kind of grief that comes when life shifts under your feet and nothing looks the way you thought it would. When my husband and I first moved into that house, things looked nothing like they do now. We bought it because nobody else wanted it. It was the old Miller place, drafty, sagging in the middle, with pipes that rattled at night like a chain gang marching through the walls. The roof shingles curled at the corners like old fingernails. The wallpaper was peeling in strips big enough to wrap a child. A sane person would have run from it. But we didn't. We saw potential. Or maybe we were just young and too in love to notice the flaws. We spent our first year patching holes in the ceiling, pulling up rotten carpet, and saving every spare dime for things we couldn't fix ourselves. My husband painted every room with his own hands, whistling off-key to Conway Twitty songs. I stitched curtains from mismatched fabric I bought at the thrift store for $2 a yard. We slept on a mattress on the floor until we could afford a bed frame. We ate off paper plates while saving for dishes. We laughed through every setback, telling ourselves, one day this will be home. And it did become home, not because it was perfect, but because we earned every inch of it. Our son learned to walk across those slanted floorboards. He learned to read under the sunlight that poured through windows we washed 1,000 times until the glass turned wavy from age. There were nights when thunder shook the house and he climbed into our bed cheeks wet with fear, whispering, "Don't let go of me, Mama." I held him until the storm passed. That's what mothers do. We hold, even when the storm has changed shape and now comes from the people we love. I leaned forward now in the church pew, elbows on my knees, staring at the altar, the velvet cloth, the pewter cross. My eyes drifted shut, and memory after memory came in waves. The first few meetings with my future daughter-in-law were polite, pleasant even. She was a pretty girl with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a handshake so firm it momentarily startled me. She talked about her ambitions, her dreams of climbing at the insurance firm she worked for. I admired her drive. But I quickly sensed she had a competitive streak she couldn't tame. I remember how she looked around my house during her first visit, not with curiosity, but evaluation. She pointed out how the kitchen cabinets really needed updating and how open floor plans are so much better. I laughed it off, telling her we couldn't afford to knock down walls. She nodded, but her lips tightened like she was swallowing a sentence I wasn't meant to hear yet. Then she married my son. And little by little, she began rearranging everything literally and figuratively. First, she suggested changing the furniture something younger and fresher. Then she brought in new dishes and told me to set the old ones aside, as if mine suddenly carried shame. I tried to let the small things slide. I told myself love and compromise were part of blending a family. But the changes grew sharper. My framed wedding picture disappeared from the mantel, replaced by their giant honeymoon print on canvas. My son stopped calling me Mom in front of her, switching to Evelyn, like the sound of Mom embarrassed them both. They started referring to decisions about the house as ours, even though no mortgage payments ever came from their bank account. It was the kind of slow unraveling that sneaks up on you. Not one big moment, just hundreds of tiny cuts. Still, I clung to Grace. I made dinner for them on Friday nights, pretended not to notice when they didn't come home until midnight. I mowed the lawn myself when my son forgot. I babysat the neighbors' kids so I wouldn't feel so alone. And then came the night, just 2 days before the confrontation, when I overheard them through the hallway vent. She'll get over it," my daughter-in-law said sharply. "We need to refinance the house, take out the equity, and start our lives. She's done her time there." Done my time. As if the life I'd built was some sort of prison sentence. As if raising my son, loving him, protecting him, paying every bill, surviving widowhood, and keeping the roof over all our heads had been a burden they now carried. My son's response was quieter, but it pierced deeper. "She's strong. She'll land on her feet." I sat on my bed that night, clutching the quilt I made with scraps of my husband's old work shirts. I remembered his words when things got rough. "Stick to the truth, Evie. Nothing stands against it for long." Maybe that was what kept me from exploding the next morning. Maybe that was why, when she stood there with fire in her voice and territorial triumph in her eyes, I didn't yell back. I knew something they didn't. I wasn't done. The truth, whatever it turned out to be, was now in my hands. And I intended to find out just how heavy it truly was. I sat there in the empty sanctuary with the manila envelope heavy in my lap, almost afraid to open it. It felt like one of those moments in life where whatever you discover is going to change the next chapter, maybe quietly, maybe loudly, but certainly permanently. The sun coming through the stained glass windows painted the pews in ribbons of amber and blue, and for a moment, I just stared at those shifting colors and let myself breathe. When my husband died, everyone kept telling me to go through the paperwork as if grief was something you could schedule between errands. I couldn't. Every time I touched one of his things, I felt like I was tearing open a seam too tender to touch. So, I boxed it all up, death certificates, insurance forms, letters, legal papers, and shoved them into the top of the hall closet. Out of sight, out of mind, until I was strong enough to face it. Turns out, strength doesn't always show up looking like you expect. Sometimes it sneaks in behind heartbreak, sits down beside it, and whispers, "I'm here now." I finally slid my finger under the flap and opened the envelope. Inside, the first thing I saw was the house deed right there in black and white. My name printed clearly, Evelyn Hart, sole owner, no conditions, no co-signers. My breath hitched. I stared at the words, letting them burn into my memory. But the second document made my heart stop altogether. A handwritten letter, carefully folded, in the same slightly crooked script my husband used to write grocery lists and birthday cards. I unfolded it slowly, like something sacred. Evelyn, if you are reading this, it means life shifted somewhere I couldn't protect you from. This house is yours in full because you built it more than I ever could. You stayed when storms came. You held us together when I fell apart. I trust you to know what to do. Take care of our boy. Remind him who he is if he forgets. Love, always, Thomas. My throat closed. I pressed the letter to my chest and rocked slightly like a mother comforting herself. I could practically hear his voice steady, warm, unbothered by trouble, because he believed everything could be solved with patience and prayer. And here I was, holding the proof that the house was never up for debate. My daughter-in-law wasn't just rude, she was wrong, legally wrong, morally wrong. But even with the truth burning in my hands, I didn't want revenge for the sake of revenge. I wanted dignity restored. I walked to the altar, placed both the deed and the letter on the wood, and just stared at them. This wasn't just paper. It was 40 years of work, love, loss, and sacrifice. It was my husband's last request. It was my place in that home, acknowledged in ink, long before any confrontation. I didn't know what to do next. March back and shout the truth. Hold the papers like a sword, kick them out the way they'd tried to kick me. There was a flicker of temptation. God forgive me the urge to storm into that house with the sheriff and have them both tossed out into the yard. But that wasn't who I wanted to become. The pastor found me there a little while later. He walked in quietly, letting the sound of his soft steps announce him instead of a greeting. When he reached the front pew, he sat without a word, folding his hands the way he always did when he was choosing his next sentence carefully. Finally, he said, "Evelyn, you look like someone holding more than grief." I handed him the deed first. He nodded slowly as he read, eyebrows lifting, understanding dawning. Then I gave him the letter. When he finished it, he sighed, and it was the same kind of sigh I'd let out earlier. A heavy one that said, "The world can be cruel, but truth still matters." "What are you planning to do?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I won't let them walk over me anymore." He nodded. "Good, because that's not humility, that's harm." I told him what happened the night before, every word. He listened, never interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "I think your son needs to see these papers. And not from a lawyer. From you." Just hearing it said aloud made my stomach twist. Confronting my daughter-in-law felt like walking into a storm with nothing but a candle. Facing my son felt harder, like going into a storm where lightning knew my name. But the pastor was right. The truth had to return home one way or another. "I'll call him," he offered gently. "Here, on neutral ground." I nodded. The tears finally spilled, then hot and unstoppable. Not because I'd lost my home, but because I'd found my worth again. It's funny how a single sentence, "This is not your home anymore," can break something open and show the strength underneath. After the tears passed, I wiped my face, squared my shoulders, and placed the deed and letter neatly back into the envelope. I set it back on the altar, not out of surrender, but out of intention. This wasn't a weapon. It was clarity. And clarity, handled carefully, can change everything. The pastor made the call while I stepped into the hallway, though the old wooden walls didn't do much to muffle his voice. I heard him say, calm and careful, "Your mother is safe. She's here at the church. I think you need to come." There was a long pause, long enough that I imagined my son staring at the phone, blinking, maybe rubbing the back of his neck the way he did when he was overwhelmed. Then the pastor added, "You should come alone." That told me everything. He knew the real confrontation wasn't between three people. It was between two hearts that had drifted apart without either one noticing until it was almost too late. I went back into the sanctuary and took my seat in the third pew on the left. The envelope sat on the altar like a silent witness, and in the morning light it almost seemed to glow. I folded my hands, bracing myself for whatever came next. Minutes passed. Maybe 10. Maybe 30. Time feels strange when you're waiting for something that could hurt or heal you. I heard the church door creak open behind me, and his footsteps were slow, not dragging, but cautious, like he wasn't sure he wanted to be there. "Mom," he said softly. It took every bit of strength I had to turn and face him. He looked older than he had the night before. Maybe he hadn't slept. Maybe guilt wore him down faster than years ever could. "I'm here," I said. I didn't run to him, didn't open my arms. I just sat and waited. I needed him to choose the next move alone. He approached slowly, glancing at the altar, then back at me. "Why didn't you come home last night? We looked everywhere." I raised my eyebrows. "You told me to leave." His head dropped. "I didn't say that. No, I agreed. You let her say it for you." Silence. Heavy, honest silence. Finally, he sat down next to me, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together, the way his father used to sit when thinking hard. "I don't know how things got like this," he said. His voice cracked just slightly enough to remind me he was still my boy, somewhere under the layers of adulthood and misjudgment. "Yes, you do," I answered gently. "You just don't want to name it." He flinched, not from anger, but from recognition. We don't like naming our own failures. Admitting we let harm happen feels worse than committing harm ourselves. I pointed toward the altar. "There's something you need to see." He hesitated, then walked to the front of the sanctuary. He picked up the envelope with both hands, careful, reverent, like it was more fragile than paper. When he pulled out the deed, his shoulders went rigid. "You didn't know?" I asked quietly from the pew. He shook his head, stunned. I assumed the mortgage was in Dad's name, or both of yours." "I didn't." "That's right," I said. "You assumed." Another lesson he didn't want but needed. Then he unfolded the handwritten letter. I watched his face change as his father's words sank in. First surprise, then sorrow, then regret. When he reached the line, "Remind him who he is if he forgets," he closed his eyes and swallowed hard. He came back to sit beside me, staring straight ahead. "I messed up, Mom." "Yes," I said quietly. "You did. I didn't soften it. Truth deserves space. But mistakes don't have to be endings. He nodded, and a tear slid down his cheek. She wasn't trying to be cruel. I held up a hand, not to cut him off, but to stop the instinct to explain away wrong behavior. She spoke words that weren't hers to speak, I said. And you let her. He didn't argue. That alone told me he finally understood. What do we do now? He whispered. I thought of all the options: legal eviction locks, changed, scorched earth battles, and bitter victories. But I also thought of the kitchen where we baked Christmas cookies, the oak tree he climbed, and my husband's letter asking me to take care of our boy. We start with the truth, I said. Not as a weapon, as a boundary. He nodded, wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand. I'll talk to her, he promised. I'll make this right. I closed my eyes. No. We will talk to her. Together. If there was going to be healing, it had to be done as a family, or what was left of one. We walked back to the house side by side, the way we used to walk to Little League practices. The house looked the same from the outside, just a box of brick and wood, but inside it felt charged like a storm waiting to roll. My daughter-in-law was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and eyes swollen from crying. Whether the tears were from fear, guilt, or anger, I couldn't tell. She stood when we entered, bracing herself. My son spoke first. This is my mother's house, he said, voice steady. Legal. Real. And she's not leaving. The look on her face was a jolt, shock, then indignation, then something more complicated. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I stepped forward, set the envelope on the table, and said, You don't have to like me, but you will respect what built this house, and you will not erase me from it. No shouting, no venom, just truth. She looked from me to my son to the papers, then hung her head. I'm sorry, she whispered. I believed she meant it, or was starting to. I didn't gloat, didn't smirk. Instead, I put a hand on the chair opposite her. We can start again, I said. But not like before. And for the first time since she entered my life, she nodded without fighting. Sometimes the heaviest truth is the one that lifts everyone back up. He didn't go to work that day. None of us did. The kind of damage that happens inside a home can't be patched in the margins of a busy schedule, and we all seem to know without saying that this was a day for reckoning, not routines. My daughter-in-law sat at the table, as if unsure which version of herself she should be: warrior, victim, wife, stranger. Her pride flickered, dying, but not dead. My son stood behind her with his hand resting on her shoulder, not possessive, but steadying. As for me, I stood across from them, envelope in hand, feeling like I was holding both a battle flag and a peace treaty at the same time. The silence in that room was a different kind than the night before. Not cold, not cruel, just raw. My son finally broke it. How did we get here? He whispered. If only it were simple. If only there were one wrong turn instead of 1,000 small ones every moment, when someone chose convenience over kindness, silence over honesty, pride over gratitude. But I knew part of the truth, the part mothers carry without meaning to. We stopped talking, I said softly. All three of us. My daughter-in-law blinked hard, as if she hadn't expected to be included in the failure or the solution. You thought I was trying to control your life? I continued. And maybe sometimes I hovered too long, stayed too close. Not because I wanted to rule anything, but because you and my son are all I have left of a life I built with my husband. I watched her shoulders loosen just a fraction. And you? I said, turning to her more directly, saw this house as a space to claim, a territory to mark, something to conquer so you could feel safe and in charge. She opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing I wasn't accusing, just naming what had already been lived out loud. And you, I added to my son, stayed quiet, hoping that would keep the peace. He looked at the floor. But silence isn't peace. I finished. It's fuel. My words hung in the air. Nobody argued because they all knew it was true. My daughter-in-law finally sat up straighter, wiping her face with the back of her hand, like a stubborn child deciding to face punishment with dignity. I felt like I married a man and got a house, she said slowly. With rules already written, traditions I didn't understand. A woman I was supposed to impress but didn't know how. Her voice cracked. So I tried to take control because I didn't have any. That surprised me. Not because it excused anything, but because it was honest. And honesty is rarer than diamonds in a family conflict. My son squeezed her shoulder. And I didn't stop her, he said. Not because I didn't love you, Mom, but because I didn't know how to love you both at the same time. It felt like I had to choose. I breathed out slowly, letting that sink in, not as an insult, but as a truth I could work with. You never had to choose, I said, but you do have to lead. He nodded, really nodded the way his father used to when he took responsibility for something heavy and unfixable without help. We all drifted to the living room, then like ghosts, relearning how to walk among the living. My rocking chair was still there in the corner, untouched, almost sacred. I took my seat, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a guest in my own house. My daughter-in-law sat across from me, hands clasped tightly. "Are you going to kick us out?" she asked quietly. I smiled, and there was no bitterness in it this time. "If I wanted to, I said you'd be standing in the yard already." The relief on her face was sharp and visible, but I didn't let her fully relax. "But we're going to change how this house runs," I continued. "And I'm not disappearing into my bedroom so you can redecorate me out of existence." My son let out a small, nervous laugh. Fair. We spent the rest of the morning doing something I never imagined we would, laying out boundaries like a map. I would continue living there, not as a shadow, but as family. They would handle some of the bills now, instead of assuming I would. I would not insert myself into every decision, but I would not be erased from any major one. And most importantly, no more whispering at night. No more silent resentment. No more speaking about each other instead of to each other. We didn't fix everything that day. You can't sew a quilt of trust in one morning after months or years of loose threads. But we made the first stitch. That evening, we ordered pizza, simple pepperoni, nothing fancy, and ate it together at the kitchen table, where a war had nearly broken out 24 hours earlier. The air still felt tender, but it also felt warmer, like the first day of spring, when the frost hasn't fully let go, but the soil knows something new is coming. After dinner, I slipped outside for a moment. The porch light hummed above me, moths circling the glow. I looked at the home, the one I fought for, not with fists, but with truth, and felt something settle inside me. Not victory, not vengeance, just belonging. And I realized something. I wish I could tell every mother who has ever felt pushed aside. Sometimes leaving the house for a moment is exactly how you find your way back into it. The next morning began before the sun lifted its sleepy head over the tree line. I was up first, the way mothers always are, no matter how grown their children become. The house creaked and sighed in the familiar places, as if acknowledging that someone who belonged inside its walls had returned to her rightful spot. I brewed a pot of coffee and leaned against the counter, letting the smell fill the kitchen. I'd made that same coffee 1,000 mornings for my husband, for my son, when he started college classes, for myself, when I worked long nights and early mornings. But this cup tasted different, like possibility, like peace that came the hard way. A few minutes later, the shuffle of slippers and sleepy footsteps told me someone else was awake. My daughter-in-law came in, hair pulled back, face soft with sleep instead of tension. She froze when she saw me, habit not hostility. Then slowly, she smiled. "Can I help?" Those 3 words meant more than she knew. Not, "Can I fix it?" Not, "Are you leaving?" Just, "Can I help?" A beginning, not an ending. We moved around each other carefully at first, like 2 dancers relearning rhythm. She put plates on the table. I scrambled eggs. She poured juice. By the time my son walked in, rubbing his eyes, the kitchen looked like it used to warm food, open chairs, 3 people who were trying. We ate in silence, but not the sharp, heavy silence of the night before. This was the kind that held space for words that hadn't formed yet. When we finished, my daughter-in-law cleared her throat. "I talked to my mom last night," she said. The sentence felt like she was offering something personal. She told me to stop trying to prove I belong everywhere I go, and just belong. She laughed, embarrassed, shy, relieved. I guess I didn't know how to do that here. I nodded. None of us did. It was the truth, and truth when spoken gently heals faster than any apology. We talked the rest of the morning, and not about chores or bills or who gets which room. We talked about fears, about growing pains, about what happens when people enter a house expecting it to stay the same, even as everyone inside it is changing. My son admitted something that surprised me, not because it sounded wrong, but because it sounded honest. "I thought loving you meant protecting you from conflict," he said. But really, loving both of you meant stepping into it. I reached for his hand like I had when he was little and afraid of thunderstorms. "I don't need you to protect me from truth," I said. "I need you to stand beside me in it." He squeezed my hand back, a promise made without the pomp of a vow, stronger than a contract. Later that week, we sat down with the notary at the church and transferred the deed into all 3 of our names, not because I had to, but because I chose to. My husband left it to me, but I decided to share it. Ownership isn't just a piece of paper, it's responsibility, and I wanted us to learn responsibility together. My daughter-in-law cried when she signed her name. Not pretty tears, messy, grateful ones. And for the first time, I saw the scared girl beneath the sharp edges, someone desperate to build a home, but terrified she didn't deserve one unless she staked her claim. Families break in the quiet places where people stop seeing each other. Families heal in those same places when people choose to look again. Weeks passed, and small changes sprouted like early spring crocuses. She put my wedding picture back on the mantel next to theirs, not replacing either one. My sons started calling me mom again, even in front of her. I let them lead more decisions without hovering. And they asked me for advice, not out of obligation, but respect. One Sunday, the 3 of us walked into church together. Whispers rippled softly through the pews. Small towns see everything, even what doesn't get spoken aloud. We sat in the 3rd row, side by side. My daughter-in-law slipped her hand into mine just before the hymn book opened. She didn't say anything, didn't have to. Some messages travel palm to palm without speech. During the sermon, the pastor said something that seemed to land directly in my chest. Forgiveness is not forgetting what happened. It is choosing what happens next. I felt my eyes sting, and for once, I didn't blink the feeling away. Choosing what happens next, that's a grace we all have access to, no matter how old we get, no matter how bruised our hearts feel. After service, I stepped outside, letting the sunlight warm my face. I looked at the steeple at the doors I had walked through alone when I thought my world had fallen apart. Then I turned and saw the two people I once feared I had lost, standing there waiting for me. Together, we walked home, not to my house, or their house, but our home. You know, I once believed vengeance meant throwing someone out the way they tried to throw me out. But I've learned something I wish I'd known sooner. Real revenge, at least the kind that saves rather than scorches, is living well, loving fiercely, and staying rooted in truth while others figure themselves out. The weight I carried into the church was heavy. The truth I laid on the altar was heavier. But the peace I carried home afterward, light enough to lift all three of us. And if you're listening, maybe from a recliner in a quiet living room, or from a lonely apartment, or a house where you feel unseen, I hope you remember this. You are not finished. Truth always finds its way home, and there is always a door, maybe in a church, maybe in a person that will open for you when another one slams shut. If this story touched, you share it with someone who needs a reminder that dignity is never wasted. Forgiveness is never weakness, and families can rediscover one another, even after the darkest nights. You are part of the circle here too. Stay with us. There are more stories on the porch if you'd like to hear them.